Around 20 minutes outside of Louisville, Kentucky, sits a massive Tudor Gothic structure on top of a hill. For decades, it served as an important hospital to fight the enormous tuberculosis epidemic, and as a result, was a facility that saw thousands of deaths. Since the institution's closure, several parties have tried to repurpose the building to no avail, and it's now considered one of the most haunted buildings in America. What's up guys, my name is Jake, and in this 83rd episode of Abandoned, let's take a deeper look into all of this, see if it's as haunted as everyone seems to think it is, and find out what the future may hold for this historic sanatorium. It just so happens that in the previous year, 1882, the tuberculosis disease was formally discovered, and the land on which Waverly Hills would be built upon would be purchased. It was acquired by a man named Major Thomas H. Hayes, and he bought it to build a home for his family. But their new home atop these rolling hills was far from any local schools which his children could attend. So they built a single-room schoolhouse and later named it Waverly Hill after the teacher's fondness of the Waverly novels. But then, that newly understood tuberculosis was spreading around the country. I say newly understood, but really this infectious bacterial disease had little effective treatments at the time. It had a terrifyingly high mortality rate, and it was spreading particularly fast in the state of Kentucky. Pulmonary tuberculosis, which mainly affects the respiratory system, seemed like a death sentence for those who contracted it. And during this time, sanatoria began popping up all across the United States and Canada. In Louisville, the amount of cases were particularly bad, and the city funded the construction of a new medical institution on the land they had just purchased from Major Thomas. So in 1910, the Waverly Hills Sanatorium opened up as a relatively small two-story clinic structure, as well as a few single-story pavilions which could house the patients. The number of cases in the area quickly exceeded the capacity they could handle, which at the time was only around 170 beds. The state then began working on a much larger and more permanent facility to house all of their patients. In 1926, a much larger four-story brick and stone structure had opened. It boosted the capacity to 400 beds, with the exterior adorned with Gothic architecture. It crucially added space though, around 180,000 square feet of it, and it was completed within 2 years at the cost of $1.1 million, or around $19 million today. Waverly Hills Sanatorium was considered state-of-the-art at the time. A cure for tuberculosis was non-existent at that point, and institutions like this were set up to accommodate treatments that were known to benefit patients. For example, the structure was set up with corridors known as sun porches. The patient rooms would line these hallways with exterior windows fitted with screens. Patient beds would be brought out onto these sun porches to soak up the fresh air and sunlight. At that point, that was the leading treatment for tuberculosis. Patients would spend as much time in the outdoors as possible, sometimes even sleeping out there, allowing their lungs to fill with the dense outdoor air. An overall positive spirit was also seen as a form of treatment, and Waverly Hills featured a library, a movie theater, sprawling outdoor space, and for children, a rooftop playground. It all had to be self-contained though, as TB patients had to be quarantined. But this was often not enough to save the lives of thousands of patients, many of whom were sent to Waverly Hills in the later stages of tuberculosis disease. Doctors would experiment with new treatments here, and while some patients claimed the institution was an inviting place, others would claim it was a lonely nightmare. Conditions were particularly bad for African American patients, whose segregated living situation was far less advanced than the primary structure. Thankfully though, by the early 1950s, drugs were being developed that successfully cured patients who suffered from the disease, and the already falling mortality rate was supercharged by this breakthrough. After hundreds of years of suffering, tuberculosis was being eradicated across the country, which really left Waverly Hills Sanatorium as an unnecessary institution. By 1961, the state agreed, as new patients had dried up, and the facility was shuttered for good. It instead reopened in 1962 as the Woodhaven Geriatric Center, a nursing home for elderly patients with advanced psychological and mobility impairments. But through the next few decades, the structure began to fall into disrepair and grew a reputation of a sometimes brutal and cruel place. Numerous state violations were identified, from patients being locked in their rooms for extended periods of time, along with some of those patients being tied to chairs. The whole operation seemed to be a complete mess, and with it losing money, by 1980 the state made moves to permanently close the facility, and acted on it in 1983, auctioning off most of the land. A local businessman named J. Clifford Todd purchased the land from the state for a little over $300,000. His plan was to convert the building into a 500-room prison. As you can imagine, though, the local residents didn't really appreciate this idea and protested hard to cancel the plan. Local government leaders agreed, and the project was dead by 1984. The land would once again go up for auction, this time being split up into 3 parcels. 2 years later, Dr. Charles B. Severs purchased the parcel of land with the primary structure on it for just $128,000. That low price was justified though, as the building had now been sitting abandoned for a few years. Unguarded, vandals and scrappers broke in and began tearing out the copper piping. The structure was listed in the National Register of Historic Buildings, but really the doctor didn't have any plans and claimed he bought it just because he thought he got a good deal. So with nothing on the books, Waverly Hills continued to sit abandoned and without a future. That was until March of 1996, when yet another new owner came in and purchased the site. Though whatever you think his plans were going to be for the site, you're wrong. The new owner, Robert Alberhaski's plan was to construct a 155-foot tall Jesus statue on the Waverly Hills site. He said that after visiting Rio de Janeiro, he was inspired by their iconic statue of Christ. So he wanted to build an even taller one in Louisville, making it the tallest Jesus statue in the world. And he was dead serious, with a whole plan made up along with a conceptual model. The total cost for the statue would rise to $3 million, with another $10 million for a whole complex of shops and a church. The old sanatorium would be turned into condos, and with donations opened up to the public, Alberhaski ended up only raising $3,000. So obviously the project was canceled. The property would continue to sit abandoned for the next few years, seeing little changes apart from a few outer buildings being demolished. The primary sanatorium would proceed to rot away, surprisingly with little documentation of the state. I could really only find a few photos out there showing it in this state. Ultimately, the property would be sold one last time to Tina and Charlie Mattingly. It was 2001, and the couple had hoped to open it up to the public for tours of the property. The family purchased it for $225,000, and it seemed like they genuinely wanted to preserve the history and restore the structure back to its former glory. But the cost to do that would be monumental, with the Mattingleys stating that a full renovation would be in the ballpark of around $50 million. But Waverly Hills was getting some attention. It was showcased to a national audience when it was featured in a 2001 episode of Scariest Places on Earth. It's definitely very 2000s television, but it perpetuated the long-standing ghost stories that had circulated locally in Louisville. Waverly Hills Sanatorium was now more than just an old hospital. It was now considered one of America's most haunted locations, and the Mattingleys were going to take full advantage of it. By 2003, tours and a seasonal haunted house were set up in the building to help raise funds for the restoration. They continued down this path over the next couple of years, with the historical foundation they had set up using the funds to clean up the immediate grounds, install new windows, and implement safety systems to meet local codes. The plan was to keep the first floor the same, turn the second, third, and fourth floors into a bed and breakfast, with the fifth floor hosting a rooftop restaurant. Those plans were ambitious, and it seemed as though there just wasn't enough money to pay for that transformation. Instead, Waverly Hills slowly crept closer to a restored state, with much of the former graffiti sanded away and the building cleaned up for seasonal events and regular tours. And there was certainly strong interest from the public to come see the former sanatorium. By this point, it had been featured in multiple ghost hunting television shows, and many agreed with the narrative of it being the most haunted place in America. And it made sense why, as Waverly Hills was packed with urban legends and ghost stories. Some of the most famous include the ghost of a small boy named Timmy who fell off the roof, a tragic event that actually did happen. Probably because for some reason they put the kids' playground on the roof. People now bring plastic balls to the area for the children to play. Legend has it if you throw a ball, it will be tossed back to you. Equally tragic, though, was the nurse who allegedly committed suicide in room 502. Perhaps the most famous, though, is the concrete tunnel within the hospital, said to have been built for the transportation of the thousands of deceased so they would be out of sight from the other patients. Now, the tunnel was originally constructed as a passageway for goods to easily move up and down the mountain. But outside of independent individuals claiming that it used to be transported for bodies, there really isn't a lot of physical evidence to back that up. From what I can see, historians are a little torn on this claim. Likewise is the number of deaths on the property. Some have claimed that 6,000 people have died here, where others claim that up to 60,000 people had died while at Waverly. The truth is honestly much harder to ascertain, as in the early years, patient records were being kept off-site in the downtown Louisville. During the flood of 1937, most of those patient records were destroyed, and even afterwards, administrative record keeping was a bit sketchy. So really, it's impossible to determine how many people actually died at the facility, or really even how many people were treated here in general. Experts and historians estimate the number is probably closer to 6,000 to 10,000, which still is pretty shocking and is a testament to just how deadly the disease was. As for the other legends, well, those are a little harder to disprove. Many have claimed to see ghosts floating down the hall, known as the Shadow People, as well as sudden temperature changes and other unsettling phenomena. I'm not here to disprove what people have seen, but I haven't seen any video footage that is outright definitive. The Mattingleys and their non-profit organization have capitalized on the public fascination, and have really turned Waverly Hills into its own brand, with a new logo, a gift shop, and regular tours across this vast structure. In the last few years, the site has seen summer 4th of July events, car meets, and so much more, turning this once abandoned hospital into a relatively thriving community event space. Now, there has been some criticism angled towards this new lease on life, as there is something to be said on how respectful all of this is being presented, since again, this is a site of massive suffering and loss. In 2022, there was actually a contestment of power between the Mattingleys and their nonprofit. The nonprofit alleged that the Mattingleys misappropriated the Historical Society's funds for personal use. There were a lot of allegations being thrown around, and it got a bit messy with an entire lawsuit. But it all came to a head later in the year when both parties agreed to collaborate and drop the suit. In my opinion, the outcome for Waverly Hills has been great to see. What's especially great about all of this is the amount of history that has been archived, particularly from the Historical Society that the Mattingleys had set up, as well as researchers from the Filson Historical Society. This is also one of the few abandoned episodes I've done where you can actually visit the abandoned location with ease. While I'm not really into the whole paranormal side of things, I am into preserving history, and I think it's great that Waverly Hills has been saved from a very unknown fate. For decades, the sanatorium faced drastic changes and concepts that would have totally reshaped its future. It's had a strange and unlikely journey to get where it is now, and while it is known as one of the most haunted places in the world, where pain and death were prevalent for years, it was also a facility where the sick could find compassion and care. People came here with essentially a death sentence, and were given everything doctors knew at the time to help them. I think that nuance is sometimes lost on what Waverly Hills was built for, and I for one am glad that it's still around today. I hope you enjoyed this spookier video for October, and if you have any other ideas of what you want me to cover next on Abandoned, leave me a suggestion in the comment section below. I really do read all comments. If you want to support my channel even further and get perks like your name at the end of each video and so much more, you can go to patreon.com/brightsunfilms. But just subscribing to the channel is also incredibly appreciated. Anyway guys, my name is Jake, and thank you very much for watching.